decisive victory of now President-elect Donald Trump has more wondering what it will mean for the conflicts in Europe and in the Middle East. Well, Iran's president reportedly said, quote, "It makes no difference to us who won the U.S. election." But I'm not sure everyone agrees with him, including my next guest. She may be inclined to disagree. Joining me now from Israel to discuss this and other developments in the Middle East is Carolyn Glick. She is a senior contributing editor at the Jewish News Syndicate and host of Carolyn Glick Show on JNS. Carolyn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on your program this week, Tony.
All right, first,
it's a big week.
Yeah, it is a big week, and I want to get the reaction from Israel to Tuesday night's election outcome.
I saw a Snap poll that said that 67% of Israelis were very happy with the election outcome in Israel, which sort of tabulates with the polls all along, which had Trump winning 65 to 75% of the support of Israelis in polling of who Israelis wanted to have as the next president of the United States. So, yeah, 2/3 of Israelis were pretty much jubilant at the results. And you can understand why.
Well, unpack that. Why? What does the Israeli public see Trump bringing to the table here?
Trump was the most pro-Israel president that Israel ever had. It wasn't just, it was he did the whole thing. He recognized that Jerusalem is Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy finally after 30 years of empty promises from presidents. And even though it was required for them to move the embassy to Jerusalem under law since 1996, he recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. He started moving away from the fake two-state solution, which is really, as we saw on October 7th, the means to eradicate the Jewish state by placing an enemy state in our heartland. He just was pro-Israel. He defunded UNRWA. He defunded the Palestinian Authority. He did so much, and he recognized the legality of Israel's communities in Judea and Samaria. So his was an extraordinary record. And then Biden came in and replaced him. And of course, he oversaw the conclusion of the Abraham Accords that brought Israel peace with 4 Arab and Muslim states for the first time in over 2 decades. So, I think he just was such an extraordinary transformational leader in terms of American Middle East policy, and he was very successful. He left the Iranian nuclear deal, and he placed crippling sanctions on Iran that dried up their reserves and their ability to finance all of their terror proxies around Israel. And then the Biden administration came in. They tried to basically kill the Abraham Accords by trying to force everybody to bow down again to the Palestinians in their midst. They reinstated U.S. financing to UNRWA, which worked out to be an in-house terrorist organization. And then once the war started, they started constantly threatening arms embargo. They slowed weapons deliveries. They sanctioned Israeli citizens who opposed the establishment of a Palestinian state and opposed continuing to resupply Hamas under the headline of humanitarian aid. They passed a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council that was totally against Israel's desires and Israel's interests and Israel's military imperatives. They tried to block every strategic action that Israel has taken and wishes to take in Gaza, in Lebanon, and of course in Iran. So they've just been horrible. They've ostracized our leaders. They've threatened to sanction our ministers. We've never had a more hostile. We've never had a more hostile administration.
Polar opposite. Is there also some expectation that with the United States not getting in the way, but actually maybe assisting, that we can see the IDF, the Israeli administration, move forward and finish off the hostilities that are taking place between Hamas and Hezbollah?
I think there's every reason to believe that the war can end quickly. The problem is, the reason that it's been so prolonged is that the United States kept subverting Israel's war effort. And, the fact that we're still in this fight, despite all the efforts by the Biden administration to try to force Israel to capitulate without defeating Hamas, without dismantling Hezbollah forces that were perched along the border with northern Israel, is a testament to the strength of the leadership of Prime Minister Netanyahu, that he was able to withstand unbelievable pressure from the administration to stand down, to accept a deal that would leave Israel in strategic peril of further invasion from the north, from the east, and constant missile attacks. We've been attacked. Iran has conducted 2 massive ballistic missile assaults on Israel in the past several months, and they're promising more. And the administration's response was to protect Iran's nuclear installations from Israel by threatening Israel again with an arms embargo and UN Security Council condemnations if Israel attacks Iran's nuclear sites. So, I mean, it's really just been one long slog with the Biden administration, and Harris promised to be even worse than Biden from Israel's perspective. So that explains, I think, the jubilation.
It's a little interesting. I saw a press report today that a senior Hamas official has called for an immediate end to the war with Israel. It would appear that they're hoping to get the Biden administration to lean in and negotiate a better deal for them to end the war before the Trump administration comes in.
Well, I mean, we'll have to see what they're talking about. Obviously, if it would involve securing Israel's military objectives, including releasing all of the hostages. 101 Israelis are still being held in Hamas's tunnels. At least, certainly over 50 of them are still considered to be alive. So, I mean, we're talking about a heinous situation, and we'll just have to see if they're willing to give us back all of the hostages and accept military terms that enable Israel to protect itself. Then that would be fine. But it really does sort of remind you of Iran releasing the U.S. hostages that were being held in Tehran for 444 days after the takeover of the U.S. embassy, and they released them after Reagan was elected president, I think the day that he was inaugurated, so or something like that. So it's along the same lines. It wouldn't be surprising.
Trump has the same approach, peace through strength. He made those comments in his acceptance speech early Wednesday morning. You mentioned Iran. The Iranian president said, it doesn't really matter who's president. We're going to continue on. Do you agree? Do you think that this changes the landscape in terms of the Middle East and Iranian activity?
Yeah, I think that American credibility is back. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration before it, kept saying, we're not going to let Iran get nuclear weapons while they enabled it. They said, we were imposing sanctions on Iran when they stopped enforcing them. And Trump imposed very, very harsh economic sanctions on Iran that brought the regime to its knees, and certainly dried up much of the wells of financing that Iran had available to pay for Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and all their other terror proxy armies. So the obvious difference is, it almost needs no explanation. And the Iranians certainly understand the distinction between Trump's policies and Obama and Biden's, which is why they've been trying to assassinate him.
Now, you've written a piece on how Trump's victory paves the way for a strategic realignment in the Middle East. You also included the firing of Israeli defense minister as also playing a part in that path. Tell us about that.
Israel has, unfortunately, a situation where many of our top security brass are really aligned with the Democratic Party in the United States. And the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and many of our retired generals, and apparently some of the sitting generals and the general staff, were working with the Pentagon under the Biden administration and scuttling the government's decisions to take actions that would have significantly changed the strategic environment on the ground in Gaza, as well as in Lebanon and Iran. So, for instance, if you remember, for months and months, you and I were talking about it was all over the news that Israel kept saying we have to go into Rafah, which is the border community between Gaza and Egypt, and seize control over the international border. And Harris and Biden and Blinken and Austin were all threatening Israel with sanctions and embargoes if we dared to go into Rafah. They kept saying that it was going to be a bloodbath, that there were over 1 million people there, and that they were all going to die, and it was all going to be Israel's fault if we went in. And their efforts were joined by Gallant, who was the defense minister, and Herzl Levy, the chief of staff of the IDF, and they kept trying to block the operation in Rafah. And it went on and on for months, and there were other, things going in and out. But basically, you saw this move that was common, that was being done together by the administration and by Gallant and the chief of staff of the army to undermine the government's plans and decisions. And the thing about Rafah that was so important was that it's a strategic objective, because if you seize Rafah, you seize the international border, then you cut Hamas off from its international supply lines, whether it's cash, personnel, war material, and we saw dozens of tunnels that traversed the border between Gaza and Egypt. Some of them were wide enough to drive a tank through. So, you're talking about a major smuggling operation that continued to go on until Israel finally got into Rafah and took it over. And the American effort to block that operation was an effort to maintain Hamas's grip on power and its survival. So you had these generals, including General Gallant, who's the defense minister until today, or until tomorrow morning officially, and they were working hand in glove with the Americans and trying to block it. And there are a lot of different reasons for it. But the bottom line is that so long as he remained defense minister, he was a political obstacle to the government, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, moving forward and achieving Israel's strategic objectives in the war in Gaza, which is to destroy Hamas as a military organization and as a political entity, and to maintain that destruction over time so that they can't pose a threat to Israel in the future. In Lebanon, it's to dismantle Hezbollah forces along the border with Israel, to allow Israeli citizens, 80,000 of whom have been internal refugees since October 8th of last year, to go home safely, and also to vastly diminish Hezbollah's missile arsenal that we've seen. They had a direct hit at Ben Gurion International Airport yesterday. They can, at their whim, paralyze half the country or more with these missiles, and so Israel has to destroy them as well. And finally, with Iran, it's to block Iran's move towards nuclear weapons. And, in all of these things, the administration was trying to block Israel from achieving its strategic objectives. And unfortunately, we had these generals, including Gallant, who were assisting them. So now you have the Trump administration coming into office in 2.5 months. And their arrival on the scene is like a knight in shining armor, saying, look, we don't oppose Israel winning anymore. In fact, we support Israel's pursuit of victory in this war. And in order to achieve that victory, though, you need the team in Israel that's going to want to pursue that victory. And you can't have generals that are aligned with the Democrat Party running the show, because they're not going to deliver what we need.
Very interesting. Carolyn, we just have about 1.5 minutes left. You mentioned 2.5 months before the Trump administration comes in. I know there's jubilation, celebration now. Is there concern about what could happen during that 2.5 months?
And there is grave concern, because the Obama administration, in its last months in office, they passed a deeply hostile resolution against Israel at the UN Security Council. It's called 2234, and it declares all Israeli presence beyond the 1949 armistice lines, including in Jerusalem, including the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, an illegal presence, an illegal settlement, and calls essentially for the international community to boycott Israel in those areas. And there was supposed to be a follow-on resolution afterwards that was going to put a timetable on Israeli withdrawals from Judea and Samaria and the establishment of a Palestinian state, and then place sanctions on Israel if Israel didn't abide by that dictated timeline from the Security Council. And Israel, working with the transition team for the Trump administration that was coming in 8 years ago, was able to block that second resolution, which would have been disaster strategically from passing. So that's a sort of thing that we can look to in terms of cooperation with the incoming Trump transition team today as well.
And I actually had a conversation with the speaker this morning, and I think with the mandate that the president feels that he has, that we're likely to see less of that happen this time, but vigilance is required. Carolyn Glick, always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.